Hey guys, the first piece of essential gear we're gonna cover here is a camera. There's a huge range of cameras to choose from nowadays, and you can basically get something at every price point imaginable. Some of the most popular categories of cameras that you might come across are action cameras like a GoPro camera, point and shoot cameras like the Canon PowerShot series, mirrorless cameras like the Sony a7S, DSLR cameras like the Canon 5D Mark IV, and camcorders like the Sony FS7 or Red Cinema cameras. Within each of those categories, you'll find budget-friendly options as well as more expensive professional-grade options. Another category that I didn't mention but is yielding better results every year is the cell phone category. Most cell phones now are capable of producing pretty impressive videos, so if you don't have any room in your budget right now for a dedicated video camera, I'd recommend just learning how to use your cell phone to the best of your ability. For the price, I honestly wouldn't recommend purchasing an action camera like a GoPro, or honestly even a point and shoot camera, because I don't think that those options are going to give you much better results than your cell phone would if you're using something like an iPhone or Android equivalent. And for the price, I think it would be better to save up for something like a mirrorless camera or DSLR that would allow you to change out the lenses. I think professional camcorders like the Sony FS7 or Red camera line would be overkill for what most of you would need, and they cost thousands of dollars for the camera alone without any lenses or accessories, and they don't really take photos, or at least not in the same way that these other categories can, so we're not really going to cover those here. Instead, I wanted to mainly focus on mirrorless and DSLR cameras in a few different price ranges. Within these two categories, you'll be able to find a ton of cameras in all sorts of different price ranges that will not only be able to take great professional looking videos, but professional photos as well. I personally like having the option to take professional photos as well as my videos with my cameras. Most of the photos for my album covers or other professional photos over the years were taken with my own DSLR camera and then edited by me. When you learn how to color correct for video, which we'll be covering later in this section, most of the same principles apply to color correcting photos as well. So with a mirrorless or DSLR, you'll be able to take professional videos as well as photos, so I think that's a really nice benefit. I don't want to get really technical here between mirrorless and DSLR cameras, but just some practical differences I wanted you to be aware of are that DSLR cameras are generally larger and heavier than mirrorless cameras. However, they usually also have larger batteries, which means DSLR cameras usually have longer battery life than mirrorless cameras. There's also, I think, a better selection of higher quality lenses available for DSLR cameras than mirrorless cameras. However, you can purchase an adapter to use different types of lenses with your mirrorless camera if you want to. You'll see some debates online that one category is way better than another, but honestly, they both offer professional results, and it'll really just depend on your personal preferences and budget. I've personally owned both mirrorless and DSLR cameras. I will say that I prefer DSLR cameras, but a lot of that just might have to do with the fact that I have more experience with DSLR cameras and am more comfortable using them at this point. I also have only owned Canon DSLRs, and I've only owned Sony mirrorless cameras, and I prefer Canon in terms of their color science and the way the camera is laid out, so that might have to do with part of my personal preference as well. Both Canon and Sony make DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, and they're both great companies. I just have preferred Canon in my own experience. And beyond those companies, there are tons of others out there like Nikon that also have a great reputation in the industry. If you've ever looked up any cameras online, you probably noticed that the mirrorless and DSLR cameras are sold in a couple of different ways. One is as a body alone, meaning literally just the camera body and nothing else. That's usually the cheapest option for buying a camera, but then you have to purchase a lens in order to actually use it. You can also purchase a lot of these cameras as part of a kit, and usually these kits come with some sort of kit lens and maybe additional accessories like extra batteries, memory cards, or things like that. I would personally recommend buying a camera as a body only and then individually choosing your own lenses to go along with that. Kit lenses usually aren't the highest quality to begin with, and you can get some really awesome lenses at a fairly low price. So I think it's better to choose the exact lenses you want versus just getting something that happens to come with a kit, unless the kit is drastically on sale, in which case sometimes it is a better buy to just go with the package that has the kit lens. It can be kind of confusing choosing a camera body because there are a lot of different features to consider, but a couple of the things that I think you'll for sure want to consider are what type of lens mount the camera has, whether or not the camera has a full frame sensor or an APS-C crop sensor, what video formats and frame rates you can film in, and whether or not the display screen can pivot out. There are tons of other features to these cameras, and you can easily see a full listing of the specs on a site like B&H Photo. I use this site for a lot of my camera gear purchases and can highly recommend it, but even if you don't plan on purchasing your camera through that site, you can search on their website and very easily find this information by scrolling through the specs of whatever camera you're considering. I'll just give you a quick overview of each of those features that I just mentioned that I think you really want to consider, but again, just be aware that there are plenty of other things that you might want to consider as well. So going through a specs list like this will be really helpful when you're narrowing down your choices. So as far as the lens mount, that just tells you what types of lenses will be physically mountable on your camera body. We'll get into lenses more in the next video, but you need to make sure that whatever lens you're buying will actually work with your camera, and generally you'll be more limited to specific brands based on what brand of camera you purchased. For example, Canon lenses won't work on Sony cameras or vice versa without an adapter, and the higher quality adapters are generally a few $100s, so that's definitely something to be aware of. As a side note, you also want to make sure that whatever lens you're choosing is compatible with your camera's autofocus system. If your lens is the right camera mount type, you'll still be able to use your lens on your camera with manual focus, but you might not be able to use autofocus with that particular lens if it's not compatible with your camera's autofocus system. Canon DSLR cameras usually have an EF or EFS lens mount, whereas Canon mirrorless cameras have a EFM mount. Sony DSLR cameras usually have a Sony Alpha/Minolta mount, and Sony mirrorless cameras usually have an E-lens mount. Again, you just want to check because most brands or camera categories aren't cross-compatible without an adapter. Alright, so moving on, you'll want to be at least aware of what kind of sensor your camera has, whether it's a full frame sensor or a crop sensor. When you put a lens on a camera with a full frame sensor, let's just say a 50mm lens for example, your camera will be able to capture a video at that exact focal length, but with a crop sensor camera, depending on what brand your camera is, your sensor will have a 1.5 or 1.6 crop factor that you'll have to account for. What this effectively means is if you put a 50mm lens on a camera with a crop sensor, you need to multiply 50mm by the crop factor of 1.6. This equals 80mm, so your 50mm lens on a camera with a crop sensor is now effectively acting as an 80mm lens. A 50mm lens on a full frame camera doesn't have any crop factor, so it's still acting as a 50mm lens. We'll cover more on focal length in an upcoming video, but for now you can just think of it as how zoomed in your image looks. A lower focal length, like this one here at 10mm, shows a much wider image, whereas a higher focal length lens like this 100mm one shows a much narrower and zoomed in image. You can see how the sensor size should factor into what lenses you purchase, because if you want to capture the look of a 50mm lens with a crop sensor camera, you'll need to use something like a 35mm lens or similar to achieve the same look, depending on whether or not your crop factor is 1.5 or 1.6. Beyond the crop factor, there are some other advantages and disadvantages to each type of sensor. Full frame cameras are generally regarded as more professional and generally have better low light performance and also produce a more shallow depth of field, which is something we'll go over in more detail in an upcoming video. Full frame cameras, however, are generally quite a bit more expensive, so if you're on a budget, you might want to choose a camera with a crop sensor to start out with. Some other things you want to be aware of are what video formats and frame rates your camera can shoot in. A lot of cameras nowadays are offering 4K video as well as multiple different HD formats like 1920 by 1080p, which is also just referred to as 1080p. I personally rarely shoot in 4K. I think only 2 or 3 of my music videos have ever been shot in 4K. Usually we shoot in 1080p. I know it's becoming standard for a lot of professional videographers, but if you're just planning on releasing videos on sites like YouTube and other social media sites, I feel like 1080p is plenty quality enough, and unless you have a really powerful computer and a ton of storage space, editing with 4K video is still a huge pain and requires a ton more computing power and storage than what most people are likely to have available. 4K also crops in on most cameras. For example, my Canon 1DX Mark II has a full frame sensor, but crops in at a 1.3 crop factor when shooting at 4K. It's not drastic, but some cameras that have crop sensors to begin with, like the Canon M50, produce a much more drastic crop in 4K mode, so it makes it kind of difficult to use sometimes. It's certainly not gonna hurt you to have that option, and like I said, a lot of the newer cameras are able to shoot in 4K now, but I don't think that it's at all a necessity to get professional results. Frame rates are another thing to consider. We'll cover this more in detail in an upcoming video, but for now, just think of frame rates in terms of normal video and slow motion. You generally want to shoot normal videos between 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, whereas with slow motion, you want to use a higher frame rate of 60 frames per second or more. 60 frames per second will give you a nice slow motion, and anything higher than that, like for example 120 frames per second, will give you ultra slow motion. 120 frames per second is going to be overkill for most people, and it's usually only available on the more expensive cameras, whereas 60 frames per second is becoming fairly standard on more affordable cameras. If slow motion is really important to you, then you also want to pay attention to the video format in relation to the frame rate as well. For example, my main camera, the Canon 1DX Mark II, can capture 4K video, and it can also capture video at 120 frames per second, but it can't capture 4K video at 120 frames per second. It can only capture 4K at 60 frames per second or below. 1080p is the highest quality, where it can capture 120 frames per second. Probably not going to be a big deal to most of you, but just something to know. And then the last thing I wanted to mention that may not seem that important, but I think actually is pretty important, is whether or not your camera has a flip-out screen. If you're filming yourself, whether music videos or vlogs, it's so much easier to set up for filming if you have a flip-out screen versus a screen that can't flip out. You can make sure you're in focus this way, as well as make sure you're in the frame exactly the way you want if you're filming by yourself. There are ways that you can work around this, like by purchasing a separate external monitor, but that's pretty expensive and also inconvenient, especially if you're looking for a budget-friendly setup. A lot of these flip-out screens are also touch screens now as well, which is pretty nice. Alright, so now that we've covered all of that, I wanted to give you guys a couple of recommendations based on different budgets. Video production isn't cheap, but you can still get a decent setup for under $1,000. I think if you're looking to get either a mirrorless or DSLR camera, you probably want to spend at least $500 on the camera body at the low end, and then you'll have an additional $500 to purchase a lens or two and some accessories like memory cards and extra batteries. If you're leaning towards a DSLR camera, I recently purchased a Canon EOS Rebel SL2 DSLR for $500 just to try out something in this price range, and this is honestly an incredible camera for the price. It's a crop sensor camera, so just remember to factor in that 1.6 crop factor when you're purchasing a lens, and you can shoot in 1080p at up to 60 frames per second for smooth slow motion, which is really nice. It also has dual pixel autofocus, which is great, and has a flip out screen, but it can't shoot in 4K. If you're leaning towards a mirrorless camera, the Sony Alpha A6000 is a great option at around $550 and is very comparable. It also has a crop sensor, can shoot at 60 frames per second at 1080p, but it doesn't have a flip out screen like the Rebel SL2. You can only adjust the screen slightly, but can't actually flip it out in order to see yourself if you're in front of the camera. Also, like the Rebel SLT, it can't shoot in 4K. If you want a mirrorless camera and 4K is important to you, but you're still on a budget, Canon's entry-level mirrorless camera, the M50, comes in at around $600 on sale. If you have a bigger budget than $1,000, I would say you're probably going to get more for your money by spending it on nicer lenses. Obviously, if you have a larger budget of a couple $1,000s, you could also invest in a nicer camera body as well, but you'll really start to see more noticeable differences in the quality of your footage through higher quality lenses rather than your camera body. It depends on what features are the most important to you, what kinds of lighting conditions you're likely to be filming in, and what you're looking to get out of your footage, but having a variety of higher quality lenses will generally help you to take better footage than having an amazing camera body with a bunch of cheap lenses. If I put a really nice high quality lens on a cheaper camera body like the Rebel SL2, then my footage is most likely gonna look better than putting a lower quality kit lens on my expensive Canon 1DX Mark Mark II camera. The higher quality camera body isn't going to make enough of a difference in capturing a high quality cinematic image in good lighting conditions, and that's because there are a lot of factors that go into creating that look, much of which has to do with the lens and the camera settings, and we'll get into all of that soon. One more thing I wanted to quickly mention that I won't be covering in a separate video are memory cards, because you need a memory card for your camera in order to store your footage, and I'd personally recommend getting at least 2 memory cards, if not more than that. No matter what, it's just nice to have an extra in case one of them fails. It'd be really awful if you planned to shoot somewhere and got to your location only to realize that your memory card wasn't working and you didn't have a backup. Besides that, it's also just nice to not feel restricted in the amount of footage that you can take during a shoot. What type of memory cards you'll need will depend on what type of card your camera accepts and how much footage you plan on taking during a given shoot and whether or not you plan on filming in 1080p or in 4K. I have a ton of different memory cards ranging from 32 gigabytes all the way up to 120 gigabytes. Again, even if you're not purchasing your camera from B&H Photo, you can easily find what type of memory card your camera accepts by going to the specs and looking for where it says memory card type. All right, that's it for cameras. Next up, we'll be talking about lenses, so I will see you guys in that next video.